Okay, I'm Christoffer Pedersen, presenting this paper by Eissler and Annelise Russel, who are here, and then my colleague Peter Mortensen, who's back home in Denmark. So this is a paper on parliamentary questions in Denmark. The agenda for it: first of all, some words about why is it worth looking at these questions to the minister and all. What's the motivation here? Then I'll say a little bit about the literature. What do we actually know about these questions? What's already been done? Then a little bit about the data and what we've done with them. And finally, some preliminary findings. We have struggled with the models and so on, so we are far from done with that, but at least we have some first results. Okay, so first on the first point, why should we study these questions to the minister at all? So what do we think we can get out of this? I mean, if you look at West European parliaments, so the traditional conception of them is that they are very party dominated. So if you want to understand something about an MP, the most important piece of information is what party does this MP belong to. That's the whole, and there's a lot of evidence that West European parliaments are still structured by political party. That's the main, so the way work is organized, and MPs play a certain role in the parties, and that's the main piece of information. So this idea of party dominance has a lot of support when you study West European parliaments. However, these questions to the minister have the special feature that they are raised by the MPs individually. So they can raise, at least in the Danish case, but in most cases, as many questions as they want, and they do it on an individual basis, so there's normally no party coordination and so on. So it's a very individual activity that the individual MP does. So there's the contrast between this idea that parliaments are structured by party, but then you have this activity which is really run on an individual basis. At the same time, you're also seeing that the number of questions have risen in most West European parliaments. They ask an increasing number of questions. We'll also show that in the Danish case in a moment. So there's a question here of have these parliaments become more individualized? So is there greater room for activities that are sort of motivated by the individual MPs? Or is the question really that these questions actually are sort of structured by the party as a party activity of the MPs? So because if that isn't the case, if it's actually a sort of individual thing that the MPs do, then there would be evidence that these parliaments are actually becoming more individualized or less party dominated than they used to be. So I think there's an interesting contrast here between this, so that behavior that is very individual, and then our normal understanding of these parliaments are structured by party lines. So that's really the motivation why we want to study these questions, why we want to have a better understanding of what's driving these questions, what's driving the increasing number of questions. Does it signal anything about a change in the relationship between parties and MPs, or is there something at the party level that is driving this? Okay, so what do we know already about this question? Actually, not so much. There hasn't been that much interest in these questions. Most studies of West European parliaments are about legislation, and so that have this finding of party dominance. And there's probably pretty good reason, because back in time there weren't very many questions in these parliaments. There weren't very much to study, and it was just seen as so that something strange, not very important part of what parliaments were doing. There were some questions, but not very many, and it wasn't considered anything that was nearly as important as legislation. There have always been some studies looking at new forms of what you could call non-legislative behavior. So many parliaments have introduced new forms of question or something that look like questions, interpellations and so on. There's been a huge development in most parliaments of these sort of non-legislative behaviors, and there's been a number of studies lying out what these changes are, how you can explain them. So that's one thing that's in the literature. It's a very institutional focused, as most of these parliamentary studies actually are. There have been a few studies at the individual level, so trying to explain why does an individual MP ask more questions than another individual MP. Looking at such things as electoral districts, seniority, and so on. There was a special issue of Journal of Legislative Studies some years ago, which has a number of country studies looking at some of these things. Generally, they didn't find very strong results. I mean, they couldn't explain very much of this question behavior by these variables at the individual level. There was some evidence, but it wasn't really, none of them found a lot of evidence that these variables at the individual level could explain a lot of this question activity. Then there's been some other studies which have another approach and looked at this from the party level. So basically ignoring which MPs actually asked the question, but looked at the party distribution, and especially focusing on the issue content. So what were different parties asking questions about? Were radical right-wing parties asking questions about immigration, European integration, and so on. And there's been a number of studies of this from a gender-setting perspective, which generally found that there are some pretty predictable party patterns in what you ask questions about. So radical right-wing parties will ask questions about immigration, European integration, and so on. And these studies are trying to explain this also by relating it to media coverage and other things. So this study will look completely at the party level, and of course ignores the fact that these questions are not asked by parties as such, but asked by the individual MP. So they lack some connection back to the individual level, explaining why is it that these individual MPs actually ask these questions. So how do these party patterns actually come about? That's a little bit the puzzle in the studies that ignore the level of the individual MPs. Okay, so our main question is really, how much of this question behavior can we explain by what we call the partisan context? So if we know, have variables that sort of relate to the party to which the MP belongs, and also factors that tells us what role does the MP play within the party, can we use that to explain the question behavior? Or do we need to know something about the incentives at the individual level? Electoral districts is the only variable we have at this point, but we want to add other like seniority and something about the competitive situation in the different electoral district. So this is really to figure out, how much of this question behavior really reflect the party to which the MP belong, and also what role does the MP have in the party? Are you the chairman, are you the spokesman on a certain issue, and so on? Or is this really driven by incentives at the individual MP level? Because this really would tell us something about what are the factors driving this question activity, also the factors driving the general increase in question activity. So this is the question we try to work towards answering. The data we have all what you call paragraph 20 questions from the Danish Parliament, and this refers to the paragraph in the statute of the Danish Parliament that lay out the rules on these questions. Basically, these are written questions that an MP can submit to a minister, and then you get an answer back within a week. Mostly the answer is just in writing. Sometimes it will be an oral answer, but most of them are answered in writing. And we have all the questions asked from 2004 to 2013. They were given to us by Parliament in a nice database format with information on the wording of the question and which MP asked the question, the dates, and a few others of the basic facts about the questions. Then we added a number of variables. First of all, we actually coded all these questions in terms of the issue content using the CAP coding scheme. I don't know if you're not familiar with it. This is an issue coding system that allows us to code this into 23 policy issues: health, immigration, environment, energy, these type of policy issues. So we actually had a measure of the content of the questions, what was the questions about in substantial terms. We coded the electoral district of the MPs. So Denmark has around 15 different electoral districts from which the members are elected, and we coded that. We also found information on committee membership. So what were the committees that these MPs were member of, based on the idea that would matter for what issues you would ask questions about. So we got, with some work, we got that information out of Parliament, so we will know which committee the MP was member of. And the committees in Denmark match very well with traditional policy issues. So there's a health committee, an educational committee, and so on. There are 25 committees. And then we also have information on whether the MP is party chairman, whether you are the chairman of the party group, which is more administrative position, and a few other as these type of individual variables that we coded into the data set. So this is the data we have. As I said, there are still some variables at the individual level we want to add about seniority and about the competitive situation within the electoral district, but that requires a pretty detailed coding of the Danish electoral system to add that. This is the number of questions asked in the Danish Parliament, going all the way back to 53 when you had a constitutional reform. So two things: there was a large increase until 2007. And then they made a reform, and the idea of the reform was there were too many questions. So questions have to be about something political. They can't be very factual, because a lot of the MPs were using the ministries to get very factual information. So the reform said that it has to have a political content, not something you can find by googling it in half an hour and so. And that had that had a pretty dramatic effect on the number of questions. But still, there are a lot of questions asked today, also from a historical perspective. But it did reduce the number quite significantly. So as in many other countries, there is large increase in the number of questions that these MPs ask. They didn't really ask many questions back in the 50s and 60s, a few hundred, but now they are so that around 3,000 to 4,000 per year. Just one thing about the question. This is the share of the questions asked by the MPs from the government parties. And as you can see, there are very few questions asked by the MPs from government parties. So these question activities, by and large, something opposition MPs do. So for the rest of the paper, we only focus on the opposition MPs. These are the relatively low number of questions by government MPs, probably require somewhat different type of explanation. So generally, this is something opposition MPs will do. Our model. Now we constructed a dependent variable having the number of questions per opposition MP per issue per session. And the idea of this dependent variable is to capture two things at the same time, both the number of questions they ask, but also the content in terms of the 23 issues. So we constructed a dependent variable with the intent to capture both aspects. So not both the content and the number of questions asked within the same variable. The model we run is a count data model, negative binomial regression, and then we added dummies for party, session, and electoral district. There's still a lot of work on the modeling part of it, but this was the first cut that we did. The findings, I don't know how well you can see this. The first thing we looked at was whether the party was a support party. If you know the Danish politics, you'll know we have minority governments, which means that there will be some parties in parliament which are not part of government, but to some extent will support the government. And the idea is that if you're an MP from such a party, you'll be more reluctant to ask questions, because questions is a way to question the government or the minister. And as you can see, there's a negative effect, so these parties do ask fewer questions than the other opposition MPs. Then we looked at the number of seats the party has, and there's a negative effect, meaning that you have an MP from a smaller party, you'll ask more questions, which probably reflects the division of labor, that some of the small parties with maybe 5, 6, 8 MPs, they have a lot of issues they cover, and they need to ask a lot of questions to cover different issues, whereas if you're from a big party with 50 MPs, then there's a less space for you in terms of the issues you can work with. We also added the color of the government and found that the left-wing opposition parties typically ask more questions than right-wing opposition parties. So these are the variables at the level of the party. Then we went to some of the variables at the individual level. If you're the chairman of the party, you ask less questions, which probably reflects that you're not part of the daily politics, so you don't really ask questions. If you're party group head, which is administrative, so the leader of the party, in parliament, then you also ask fewer questions. Then also we added this variable which matches the committees with the issues. So if you look at, if you're a member of the committee at the issue, we'll look at, for instance, if you look at number of questions on healthcare, if you're at the same time member of the healthcare committee, you'll ask more questions. So this is one of the things we expected, that the committee membership matters for the type of issues you address in the questions. Then we also added two agenda setting variables, the debate and the manifesto. The manifesto, we looked at the party manifesto and said, okay, what's the agenda the parties have there? And if it's an issue that's high on the agenda in the manifesto, then generally also ask more questions, the MPs in parliament. The debate is an agenda setting measure at what's going on in parliament in general, in the same session in terms of issues. So what are they debating in other ways? And again, we found if there's an issue that's high on this agenda, it also generates more questions from the MPs. Yeah, then we added a few others of the control variables, but I'll leave them out. Just to sum up the findings, I mean, the parties and content clearly matters in two respects. I mean, that the party, if you're a government opposition support party, the agenda the party has in the manifesto, that will affect the number of questions they ask and what the questions are about. Then also the role of the MP within the party, what committee positions do you hold, are you the chairman and so on. These things will also matter for your question activity. And then finally we did something that I didn't show. We added these dummies for electoral district, and we actually found that they do have some explanatory effect if you look at it from a statistical perspective. But it's still, to us, a little bit unclear what it means in substantial terms. So we can see that there are some questions, more questions from MP from some electoral district rather than others. But we haven't really found a good explanation. Well, what is the difference that matters here in substantial terms? Okay, good.